Welcome to the 2021 Wilmington Spring Workshop.
So with this presentation, I'm going to cover, it's an email I sent out recently on our 30-day ILM grid verification, and I'll kind of relate that to the upcoming NBM forecast builder demo. I'll start off with core basics of the verification, and the reasoning behind doing 30 days here is at the end of the calendar year last year, 2020, I updated all the bias corrections in the model blends for the conshort and the super blend early in January, so it gave me a fresh 30 days. There was some goofiness in there for a period of time because we had that wedge scenario for a long time, but for the most part, the numbers are updated. We got a lot of good cases in there over the course of 30 days. So I just want to start by a shameless plug again on this procedure. ILM ISC discrepancies is sort of related to what I'm talking about, but I recommend running this whenever you do an update. It doesn't take that long to run, but it just ensures that we're not out of tolerance with neighbors. The elements on the right are all the ones that have directive allowed ISC tolerances. You can run this over a selected time range if you just did a small update, or you can run it over the entire forecast database. And in general, I'd run this after doing a grid check, because some of these elements like the RH, POP 12-hour, and QPF 6 hours are derived grids that are run off the grid check. So otherwise, you could just put that selection in the middle of the yes. But for the most part, the default should be fine. And you'll get banners if anything was out of tolerance, and then you'll also have your grid and GFD turn to red, so you'll know which one's out of tolerance. And then it gives you a really easy heads up on what you might need to adjust or change, and saves a ton of time from having to look at every single individual grid in ISC to see if your neighbors are off. And obviously you want to run this kind of late in the shift. You don't want to run it probably at 2 p.m. on an 8 shift because your neighbors might not all be done with the forecast. But once you're a little later on, but you have enough time to make a change if need be, just something to consider utilizing. So the verification methodology is to use Boy Verify. It was a pretty large time range here. I went all the way from 12 hours to 162 hours. I focused on mean absolute error against IRMA over the ILM landmass for a whole array of variables, max T, min T, dew point, sky, and a bunch related to wind. I hope to get POP and QPF working at some point, but it's a little tricky in Boy Verify. But that's something to look at in the future. And with this, I looked at common cases because then it's a little more fair and equitable, and you don't have one data set missing for a period of time where the models are way off. This ensures that there is data available for all these things at the same time. So NDFD, which is our official forecast, NBM, and then conshort in the near term, and superblend in the extended. So just one slide on what are conshort and superblend, just as a reminder. They're local model blends that are bias corrected and run hourly. And I have different bias corrections for each model for different times of day. I'll give you an example on the right. That's the normal conshort 12Z temperature bias. So we tend to be too warm near the coast and then too warm over South Carolina for the most part. So when the conshort runs every hour, I post-process it with this bias correction to make the verification improve over time. And in the long run, it's showing that the verification is better than the NBM, HER, the GLAM 25, the vast majority of the time, which I'll talk about shortly. And then the hour-by-hour bias corrections are mainly focused on temperatures and dew points, and then I have more of a subtle bias correction for other things like wind and sky, which don't really have much variation throughout the day in terms of the biases. The other advantage of the conshort is it initializes with the odds in the RTMA, and then it also has some influence from the odds in the RTMA over the first 1 to 2 to 3 hours. So to start off with a near-term verification, we'll go through each element. This is hourly temperature. MBM for all these images are going to be in green. Yellow is NDFD, and blue is conshort. And you can see right off the bat that forecasters are adding value. The NDFD is beating both the conshort and the MBM, especially in the first few time frames there, and then later out there's more a convergence of the verification. But for the most part, the conshort and the NDFD are ahead of the MBM. That's for temperature. Dew point, you see something fairly similar as before, where the forecasters are adding value a lot in the first 24 to 36 hours, and the conshort's doing somewhere between the NBM and the NDFD. For Sky, again, this is kind of a fluky period because we had that wedge in place for almost half the time, but the Sky verification is similar with it. Conshort and the NDFD perform reasonably well, even in the later time frame. Wind direction, again, nothing. I'm not going to spend too much time on every single slide, but it kind of shows what we were showing before. Now, the thing about wind speed, look at wind speed, and the MBM is beating our NDFD and the conshort. And I do not have a bias correction in place for the conshort with this because I don't think it's really matching reality. I mean, I could make the numbers look good and have it beat the MBM just by doing the bias correction. But in my mind, it's not improving the product to your customers because the MBM and the IRMA both have a documented low bias. So they perform very similarly. And when you compare it to actual observations at the airports, it's oftentimes too low. And I've heard this several times on the VLAB forums for RTMA and IRMA. So for now, it makes us look like we're off by a little bit more. But this is just respect to IRMA again. So take it with a grain of salt. Extended verification now. Now we'll focus more on the super blend instead of the conshort. Looking at max T, 48 hours out to 168 hours, shows the super blend and the NDFD ahead of the MBM for pretty much every single time frame. Min T is the same as well, except that one, it looks like once at 84 hours, the super blend did a little bit worse. But otherwise, it's pretty similar to the theme we've been seeing so far. Dew point as well. Super blend NDFD performing well. Basically below the green line the entire time. Sky, similar situation here. Not much to add really. I mean, just wind direction, what we saw the conshort again. Wind directions are better with the super blend with the MBM, all time ranges again. Now, wind speed, it suffers the same fate. Super blend suffers the same fate that conshort had, where it has a high bias, so that's reducing its mean absolute error. But the high bias is respect to IRMA, which has a documented low bias. So it's kind of an iffy situation here, but this is the way it turned out for the most part. Now, one thing I did want to talk about is with the wind gust verification. Wind gusts, I have not heard issues with the IRMA as much. I'm not saying there aren't issues, but it's usually just wind speed. And I changed about 30 days ago, I changed the way the super blend does the wind gusts. And I don't blend a bunch of models to get the super blend. All I'm doing is I'm running our local wind regression tool on top of our super blend winds. So that's allowing for more it's allowing for the winds and the wind gusts to stay a little bit in line, and you won't get flaky things. And it's working out quite well. It even looks like the forecasters are using the super blend a lot for the wind gusts. But the verification shows they're almost 1 to 2 knots, which is fairly significant in the bulk verification study over the MBM. So wind gusts is definitely something we're doing right. So we'll go through some conclusions and key takeaways. The biggest takeaway is a blanket use of MBM will not improve forecast quality, as shown in comparison to both our current NDFD forecasts. So the whole conshort and super blend thing aside, current NDFD forecasts are already beating the MBM, and we're doing really good as an office in that regard. And then, like I said, utilizing conshort and super blend. Now, the differences are small on the graphs if you compare like the y-axis, but whenever you do a bulk verification study, that's pretty typical to see. You're going to have really small differences. I could have thrown up the raw GFS or just some random model, and the line would have been slightly above the MBM or something. So when you do a bulk verification study over a long period of time, you're always going to have small differences. But again, it's not. We're focused on what's the best for now and what's useful to use. Since all of this is available and it all takes the same amount of time to load into your forecast database. And like I said, the contour and super blend, I already mentioned, is superior to MBM the vast majority of the time, except for wind speed, which I talked about the issues with the IRMA and the MBM. NDFD many times has less error than both the MBM and the contour super blend. So this goes along with what I said before. The forecasters are clearly adding value onto the forecast, especially in the earlier time frames, but even in the later time frames, where the mean absolute error of the NDFD is less than the MBM for pretty much every field. Also, in terms of consistency, because that's sort of the concern right now in the focus, well, the contour and the superblend values are very rarely different enough from the MBM to cause any kind of collaboration or ISC tolerance issues. And I mean, I've used the superblend and the extended, and when I run our ISC collaboration procedure, I rarely see any things that are out of tolerance. I mean, a lot of times it could be a neighbor hasn't updated their forecast or something. But the other thing you have to remember is even if you wrote in the MBM, you still have to make sure that you're within tolerance with the neighbors, because everyone else might not be using it anyways. So ultimately, it's the same workflow for the most part. So it's definitely worthwhile to consider utilizing them, since there's no policy to only send out the MBM. So this is my last slide. I'm going to tie everything into the upcoming Eastern Region MBM and Forecast Builder demo. Now, I know there's a lot of different versions. There's a lot of iterations going on with this. And the one thing that's remained pretty consistent, I mean, they're just trying to figure out timing of when to do the long term. But the one consistent thing is that the agreement states to start your long-term forecast with the NBM and the Forecast Builder. Forecast Builder, that is in phase 2 of this demo. But to start with those things, but there's absolutely no requirement that it would be your final forecast. So my recommendation is that after meeting the initial requirement, and by the way, in terms of the initial requirement under phase 1, you can simply run one-click MBM loader, a procedure I wrote under the edit menu, and that fully 100% meets the requirements of the demo. It'll load all the grids in the extended included in the study, so not wind or wind gusts or weather or things like that. Mainly the public grids that are part of the demo, and then you can continue to utilize your local tools, methods, superblend, and whatever you think helps to put out the best possible forecast. Now, there are some weaknesses with the idea of blanket loading and sending out of NBM and Forecast Builder without utilizing local techniques and having forecaster edits. The first of which, obviously, with our verification I just showed and the verification going back years, doing this would lead to less accurate ILM forecasts, as clearly shown by our verification. Also, it does not advance your office roadmap goals. Main roadmap goal right now, forecast quality. Everything I've said so far ties into forecast quality, obviously, and also IDSS, the other goal, which is derived from our forecast too. So that's something to keep in mind. And the other thing I wanted to bring up, we got an email recently, all hands email about office culture, and that's not something I really talk about with GFE stuff. I know a lot of this has been about numbers and science so far, but office culture is another thing to keep in mind as well. And it's something we've been working on here at the office. And I think we all want a high-performance culture. And having flexible policies and procedures in place, which is what I'm an advocate for, having forecasters the ability to pick and choose what works on any given day and to utilize tools that have been proven to work effectively, outweighs the idea of having a rigid policy and procedure saying you must use Forecast Builder, which will lead to a low performance culture. Another thing is blanket loading of the MBM is not necessary to prevent collaboration ISC tolerance issues. Again, it's very important that we're focusing on collaboration. However, as I said, the Contour and the Super Blend are rarely different enough to cause collaboration issues. But you might actually run into a time where you use the Super Blend because it's actually using the 12Z data in the afternoon, and it is off by the neighbors because they're using MBM from the previous night's runs, and you might need to chat them over that and get everyone in line to make some changes. So there might be some times where changes are necessary, and that could actually be because it's using more recent data instead of really old data like the MBM's using in the afternoon. Number 4, I could have done a whole presentation on just number 4, but just to get it in line with the statement above about blanket loading is there's going to be a whole host of issues if you just run the forecast builder, and we don't see these issues right now. Weather grids are extremely problematic. They're almost unreadable. A lot of times you have over 100 weather types. It's tough to know what's going on when and where. If you had a caller ask you when the changeover is going to occur for P-type, as I showed in our winter event at the Winter Weather Workshop, it's almost tough to see what's going on, and a lot of times the grids don't even make sense. So it's just something to keep in mind. The other thing is CWF, which is our flagship marine product, will not include visibility with the forecast builder, and I brought this up about 18 months ago and it hasn't been addressed, but it's basically just looking at what you have in your visibility grids, but we need a visibility appended to the weather grid to get into the CWF for the way the formatter works. And our grid check runs that, but the forecast builder does not. So something to keep in mind. I think when we have one nautical model or less to share with the partners, we want that to be included and not excluded from the CWF. Another thing is the gust factors a lot of times don't make sense. That's why I came up with the methodology with just running the wind regression tool off the Super Blend winds to give a wind gust that actually makes sense. But I think the MBM is blending wind and then wind gusts separately with different components and different weights, and then you get a mismatch of things that don't make sense. Like the other day, I saw 1 to 2 knot sustained winds where we had gusts to 10 knots. So, I mean, it's basically showing almost a 10 gust factor, and I would never trust using that for something like our digital TAFs also. So something to keep in mind. Also, marine headlines are going to be missed because a lot of times the winds are too low, which I mentioned. We tend to, as an office, try to mention small craft possible in the HWO out in time. Because of this washing out and low bias of the winds, we're probably going to be missing some of this mentions as well. Also, storm total grids are not computed, and our threat grids are not populated also, which we kind of use for hazard decision making as well. And then finally, at the end, I mean, even if you didn't agree with everything I just said, I mean, the bottom line is it's not required to use as your final forecast. And technically, there'd be really no reason to require it because at that point, the forecast builder and all the grids could be run in the background on a cron and completely out of the forecaster's hands. It would save more time than having them run through this process to begin with. So for the time being, all you have to realize, if you don't remember anything else, is you start your long-term with the MBM forecast builder, and then you can do what you want also after the fact, assuming you stay within the ISC collaboration tolerances. So any questions or comments on this?
Hey, Matt, it's Mark. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep. First off, great work, Matt. There's a lot of hard work and good info in here. I think our office is very lucky and has a leg up from all the work that you've done and your expertise. I did want to comment, I definitely think that we need to, regardless of what tool that we use, we always want to add value and find opportunities to improve the forecast and get our customers the best information in a collaborative sense. I'm assuming that we're going to hear something soon from Eastern Region that they have a new date for the restarting the MBM project, and then a few months down the road, forecast builder or whatever tool they decide with I'm assuming that information is coming soon. And I wanted to reinforce that we're being asked to initialize days 4 through 7 as just a starting point for that demonstration. So my ask is to give it a shot, right? Let's do our best to give it a shot, provide feedback, but always, as you alluded to very well, add value where we can in a collaborative sense with our neighbors. I also did want to say that strategically, the feeling I'm getting when I bring some of the concerns up to SSD, et cetera, is that there's a lot of offices around the country that don't have the expertise that we have, and maybe don't have super blend or con short or whatever. So that puts the agency in a challenge. And I think that they've decided, for lack of a better term, to focus a lot of our resources on the MBM strategically over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And look, I know we have the moratorium right now, and that's going to impact things, but I definitely think that's a part of what's going on at the higher levels of our agency to focus on the MBM with time. And also I think that there's, as Neil Jacobs talked a ton about before he left, that there's a lot of benefits to decentralizing model development, localizing support, but delocalizing computer resources. And it seems like that's the direction that the agency is heading. And I think Neil was really good at articulating that. But I just wanted to put that big picture out there, because I think that does play a role in the long-term, success or growth of this whole project that, to me, is still very early, and the policies and the mandates and the development, things like that. It's a lot of the concerns I think are going to shake out, but this is a long haul project for sure. And I also wanted to mention that you made some really good points about forecast quality and verification and things that we're focusing on, and verification incredibly important. But I don't think that forecast quality is 100% verification. I think that there's a lot more that goes behind that with respects to messaging, flip-flopping forecast, which, look, I know the MBM has that problem, that we provided that feedback, but I think there's a little bit more that goes into it. And I don't think you're implying that it doesn't, but there's more than just verification that goes into forecast quality. But bottom line, and thanks for listening, but I think whatever we use, and whatever the region agency decides, we have to quality control and find places to add value in a collaborative fashion. And I'm confident we're going to do that. And look, I just ask that when we get the updated policy or mandate, whatever we want to call it, from region, that we give it a shot, be collaborative, and do what we can to steer the ship. I think we have a big opportunity because of the expertise we have here to help influence things. And I think that's starting to happen. It's just the gears of the government grind slowly. And I think it's going to be a long time before we get to where we need to be, but we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think the focus on this is obviously consistency with neighbors. And like I said, the consistency issues I've seen have nothing to do with what tool someone ran or what data set they use. A lot of times the super blend does not exceed tolerances. So I don't think there's going to be any issues with consistency, especially with that new procedure where you can actually check to see if you're out of tolerance with neighbors or not. So.
Yeah, one thing, this is Reed. One thing I'll mention, they talk about the tolerances, and we've kind of bashed around. They're pretty, the tolerances are really high, and probably are too high, and also color schemes make this difficult, because I always see Sampson County stick out like a sore thumb all the time. But that's we're looking at what our perspective of our users at a larger scale, not just the CWA, but there's lots of, like Mark said, there's lots of things to overcome.
Yeah, and if we want to update, if headquarters wants to update the tolerances, they can do that whenever they want, and I'll adjust the procedure. But for now, all we can go off of is the policies in place. So